Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nonprofit Auditor Points. I'm Irina Ryshkova, your nonprofit auditor. We just completed our series on fixed assets, and before that, we spent several episodes discussing revenue recognition for nonprofit organizations. So, if you are interested in those topics, please revisit our previous snaps. Today, we're starting a new series. And this time we're moving beyond the accounting topics, and I want to talk about the area that affects almost every nonprofit, not almost, but every nonprofit and every company and organization. The topic is policies. Most nonprofit have some policies. Some may have few basic policies, others have extensive policies manual covering everything from conflict of interest, expense reimbursement or investment, cybersecurity, and document retention. But unfortunately, just having policy does not mean that nonprofit has effective policy. It's not the same thing. The goal for every nonprofit have to be to have policies that suits specific nonprofit organizations. Sometimes organizations adopt policy because somebody told them that they have to have one. So sometimes policies are copied from online or from another nonprofit that was applicable many years ago, and nobody looked at that policy ever since. And sometimes organizations have a detailed written policy, but the people who are supposed to follow the policy don't even know about existence of that policy, and they actually practice completely different things in real life. So in this new series, I want to talk about policies, but in a practical way that it's really going to benefit nonprofits and make them safer, more efficiently, and less risky. We will talk about conflict of interest policies, whistleblower and complaint policy, document retention policy, expense reimbursement policy and credit card policy, procurement and financial control policy, gift acceptance, operating reserves, investments, cybersecurities, and definitely AI policy. And we will also talk about some other areas. But before we're going to start discussing individual policies, we need to answer some basic questions. Why does organization need to have a written policy in the first place? Let's start with the definition of the word policy. What does it mean? Policy is essentially a formal establishment of rule or framework that explains how the organization intends and should handle a particular area of operation. So it's pretty much a set of rules. Does the nonprofit wants to have a set of rules? Absolutely. For example, an expense reimbursement policy may establish what type of expenses organization will reimburse, what documentation is required, and who is authorized to approve the reimbursement. Conflict of interest policy will establish when board members and other individuals must disclose potential conflict and how the organization will handle those situations and resolve the issue. An investment policy may establish the organization objectives and limitations for the investment funds. So policy creates consistency of application and handling the same events or transactions for the organization. Instead of deciding what to do every time in a similar situation, the organization establishes a set of rules in advance. That's a policy. And it becomes particularly important when organization grows, when the new people come on board, when more people involved in the processes. Imagine a very small nonprofit with one executive director, one bookkeeper, and a very small board. Everybody knows each other, people communicate frequently, and they handle decisions very informally, and everybody is involved. Now imagine the same organization several years later. Now it has 15 employees, several programs, multiple funding sources, different credit cards, significant grants, and maybe federal grants or other government grants, and several $1,000,000 in annual revenue. Every nonprofit wants to grow this way, right? Yes, but it might be challenging for the overall organization infrastructure and the sets of rules, or policies, and procedures that people now have to follow. If every purchasing decision, reimbursements, conflicts, or financial transitions is handled based on what somebody remembers doing last time, inconsistencies gonna happen. Problems will occur. Written policies help create a framework so that similar situations do not need to be revisited all the time and decided and approved by everybody in the same every time. Because written policy and procedures will make sure that similar situations are handled in the same way. However, simply having a written policy is not enough. A policy only becomes useful if it reflects how the organization actually operates and when the people affected by policy understand it and follow it. For example, an organization might have expense reimbursement policy that require receipt submission, approval by employees of every expense incurred. But if employees regularly submit expenses without receipt, without any approval, without explanation, then the organization has a written policy that's not actually followed. There is no purpose for that policy. Or organization might have a purchase policy that require additional approval for purchases above the certain threshold. If those purchases are routinely made without the approval, and again without anybody third party looking at and following procurement policy, then the organization lacks a policy. Simply establish the policy does not mean you follow the policy and it helps organization in any way. So the problem will arrive one way or another if the organization does not follow written policy. This is why adopting the policy should not be the end of the process. So when we're saying adopting the policy, meaning creating policy, hopefully approved by the board, but it's not the end of the process. The organization needs to communicate the policy to the people who are involved in the process, and there has to be real expectation that the policy will be followed. So there has to be oversight process to ensure that the policy is followed. So, does every nonprofit need the same policy? No, absolutely not. It really depends. And an important point of this series, there is no single policy manual that is appropriate for every nonprofit. You probably can go online and download some policies, but it does not mean that your nonprofit need this policy or they're suitable. A small nonprofit organizations who have like 3 or 2 employees with 100,000 or 200,000 annual budget does not necessarily need the same policy as a large organization that operates on several $1,000,000 and has like 15 or 100 employees. An organization does not make investments, does not have resources for investments, does not need the same investment policy as the organization that manages significant endowment, has a board designated assets, that has a permanently restricted net assets. Those are completely different set of rules. An organization that never accepts unusual non-cash contributions may not need a different gift acceptance policy that the organization that would accept cryptocurrency or maybe significant non-cash donations, other securities or properties, those policies would be very, very different. So policies should reflect actual organization size, needs, and their frame of operation. So it will depend on the size, activities, risks, funding sources, and overall where the nonprofit operates. Some nonprofits may operate also overseas, and that will affect the policies. So this is one reason I'm sometimes concerned when the organization simply download policy template from the internet, changes the name, and have the board to approve it. Or sometimes copy it from another nonprofit because a board member also member of another nonprofit. Templates would be actually a great point to start, but each policy needs to be adopted as its own. The question is always whether the policy actually makes sense for the organization. Suppose the policy requires 3 competitive bids for every purchase over $1,000, but nobody in the organization actually followed that requirement. Suppose the policy required 2 signatures on every check, but the organization stopped using paper checks years ago and now makes payments electronically. Technically, the policy exists, but in practice, it no longer describes how the organization operates because these policies no longer applicable. And that can create their own problems. From the auditor standpoint, one of the important things is consistency between what the organization says it does and what it actually does. If the organization adopts the policy, it needs to list reasonable expectation that the policy will be followed. It's convenient. For example, if there is 2 signatures on the checks, then the organization needs to make sure that there's probably board member always available to sign as a second signer. It does not mean that the policy should not change. It's quite contrary. Policy should change often and adapt to the current situations. As the program grows, technology changes, funding sources changes, new risks develop, policy may need to be reviewed and updated. And I would say that's a very good rule of thumb that board needs to review policy annually, at least annually. Artificial intelligence is a good example. Several years ago, very few nonprofit organizations were thinking about whether employees should follow any AI system, should use any AI. I remember pre-COVID, few nonprofits were retaining their documents in electronic format. It was all paper. Look where we are right now. Almost none of nonprofits keep their records in a paper format. So the same thing happens with the cloud storage, electronic payments, remote work process, and other technologies. Policy needs to reflect the environment in which the organization actually operates. Another important question is who approves the policy. And again, the answer is not necessarily the same for every nonprofit. Some policies are governance policy and appropriately require board approval. Other matters may be administrative procedures established by management. And the board general should not be deciding on every detail, how employees process, invoice the purchases, how electronic files organized. That's not a board prerogative, and they would not be best bodies to approve such policy. In the same time, management should not be making certain government's decisions that properly belong to the board approval. The distinction between governance and management is important, and we will come back and think about it. Who is appropriate body to approve the policy? For now, the important point is that the organization should understand who has an authority to establish a particular policy, who is responsible for implementing, and who should monitor or review that the policy are followed. Policies are also not limited to the areas we're going to cover in this series. For example, in our previous discussions, we talked about fixed assets. And organizations may have accounting policies address capitalization threshold, useful life of fixed assets, depreciation methods, and other fixed assets matters. And before that, we were talking about revenue recognition. An organization also need to consider accounting policies for revenue recognitions for contributions, earned revenue, grants, exchange transactions, donor restrictions, and other type of revenue. We are not going to repeat those accounting topics in this series because we covered them already in details in previous snaps. Instead, we're going to expand the discussion of the policies to other areas of nonprofits that affect governance, financial controls, organization resources, and risks. And we are going through the series. There is one thing I want you to remember in mind. The objective is not to collect all policies because somebody told you so. The objective to identify policy that your nonprofit actually needs. How? You know what rules your organization need to follow that appropriate for your organization currently in the current state of your nonprofit. A beautifully written policy that nobody reads and nobody follows, it's not accomplish anything. A good policy help people make consistent decision and know that they are right and they are good team members. It should establish responsibility, who is responsible. It should protect nonprofit, and it should provide enough guidance to the people who involved in the process and expectation what they need to expect from others and what they need to do. So before we finish today, let's summarize what we're gonna cover in next about 10 episodes. Written policies, it's the organization's rules and expectations. And your nonprofit wants to have those rules so people do not assume or make up their own rules. They know what they need to do and they know what to expect from others to do. Not every nonprofit have to follow the same policies. Policies should reflect your nonprofit actual operations and risks. And once policy is adopted, it's a step number one. Policy needs to be followed, periodically reviewed, and make sure that it's still applicable and suitable for your nonprofit. So over the next several episodes, we're gonna talk about these concepts. We're gonna talk about how to apply them, and we're gonna talk about what common areas, problem areas nonprofits encounter when they set up policy and procedures. We're going to start next time with one of the most important governance policy. It's a conflict of interest policy. We will discuss what conflict of interest policy is, when it exists, how it should be addressed and handled by a nonprofit. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to our next snap. Thank you for your support. Have a wonderful day.